It's the late evening of a foggy November night in 1966. A powder blue Chevrolet is parked stranded on a desolate strip of country road just outside of Garibaldi, Oregon. The engine continues to purr in the chill air, headlights cutting through the heavy Pacific fog. The driver's door is left open, creaking gently in the breeze, as if whoever was inside got out quickly. Lying in the wet grass alongside is one woman's shoe, a plain, low-heeled shoe, the kind an elementary school teacher might wear. But the woman, 23-year-old Sienna Rae, is missing. When Sheriff's Deputy Frank Morales arrived at 11:42 p.m., he anticipated just another breakdown on the side of the road. What he saw, however, was the start of a mystery that would plague Oregon for more than half a century. "I remember thinking that it didn't make sense," Morales has since written in his memoir. People don't just disappear into thin air, but somehow that's just what Sienna Rae appeared to do. Her vanishing swept the sleepy coastal town into shock. Search parties canvassed the woods. Divers searched nearby lakes. Posters bearing her bright smile were tacked from Garibaldi to Portland. And still nothing. No blood, no struggle, no footprints away from the car. Only an empty vehicle and one shoe. As if she'd been swept off the ground by some magic hand. For years, the case went cold with each passing decade. Theories accrued. Kidnapping, voluntary disappearance, even homicide. But none neatly fit. And no one could have known the truth in wait that would be discovered decades later. When the complete story at last came out in 2008, it didn't merely unravel the mystery of a lost schoolteacher. It ripped open a half-century of government deceptions and cover-ups, a disclosure so stunning it would rewrite all that the town believed it knew. So, if you're drawn to cold cases that take decades to unravel, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Because this isn't your average missing person story. It's one of the most extraordinary cases in American history. And while you're here, where are you watching from tonight? Leave your city in the comments below. Because no matter where you are, this story's going to take you somewhere you never saw coming. To a place where truth and identity and deception all meet. In 1966, Garibaldi, Oregon, was the type of community where individuals left their doors open and waved at everyone they met. Situated between the raw coastal mountains and the expansive Pacific, this fishing town of slightly more than 2,200 people lived on trust and relationship. Main Street boasted a few stores: Harley's General Store, the Coastal Diner, Thompson's Pharmacy, and the always boisterous Salty Dog Tavern. The town's gem, however, was its spanking new elementary school, where Sienna Rae had taught second grade for more than a year. She'd moved to Garibaldi in the summer of 1965, right after earning her teaching degree from Oregon State University. With her warm smile, sharp hazel eyes, and genuine care for her students, Sienna quickly became a local favorite. Parents respected her. Fellow teachers admired her creative classroom ideas. And the kids? They adored her. "Miss Rae made learning an adventure," said Thomas Jenkins, one of her past students, now in his 60s. She could bring a storybook to life. Even the shy kids felt like they mattered to her. Sienna had lived a few blocks from the school in a little blue cottage on Cedar Street, within earshot of waves on quiet evenings. Neighbors spotted her frequently, walking the beach, picking up shells and driftwood, treasures that eventually appeared in class art projects. She sang in the town choir, worked at the library, and occasionally joined the Ladies' Bowling League. But behind that friendly smile, there were things about Sienna that no one really knew. Her home had no family photos, no childhood keepsakes. Whenever someone asked about her past, she'd gently steer the conversation elsewhere. The only family anyone ever heard her mention was her younger sister, Dorothy, who lived up in Portland and visited occasionally. And that, as it turned out, was where the first cracks in the story of Miss Rae would begin to show. November 12, 1966, the night of Garibaldi's annual Harvest Festival. Each autumn, the entire town came out for it. The community center was spruced up for fall, corn husks, gaudy pumpkins, browning leaves draped along the rafters. The air was filled with the aromas of spiced cider and apple pie as a local band went through spirited folk music. Couples danced to the warm light of hanging lights, and their laughter blended with the music. Sienna Rae also came in at about 7:30 p.m., dressed in a forest green dress and a plain gold necklace that glinted when she moved. Her dark hair was pulled up neatly, revealing a pair of pale pearl earrings. Sienna was recalled by people laughing, dancing, and making small talk with friends and parents of her students. She appeared to be herself, perhaps even happier than normal. At about 10:15, witnesses observed her talking to Walter Grayson, the science teacher at the high school. The discussion appeared serious but not heated. At 10:42, Sienna glanced at her watch, exchanged polite goodbyes with the little cluster she'd been talking to, and said she had to grade papers. "See you tomorrow at church," she said to her colleague, Meredith Collins. Those were the last words anyone in Garibaldi would ever hear Sienna say. When Sienna did not arrive at Sunday service, not many people paid much attention to it initially. But by Monday morning, when she also did not make it to school, worry began to rise. Principal Howard Larson attempted to accompany her to her cottage. No one answered. A few colleagues visited at her house over lunch to visit. The lights were out. Her weekend bag was gone, the bed made. All was wonderfully ordinary. Too ordinary. It wasn't until Deputy Morales spotted her abandoned Chevrolet later that day that the feeling of dread escalated to outright alarm. The search began at once. Sheriff Robert Tanner deployed search parties to comb the woods and beaches along where the car was discovered. Bloodhounds were called in, but their trail ended completely at the roadside, as if Sienna had poofed into thin air or been swept away. Divers searched Tamaki Bay. The FBI was on the scene within 2 days. "We are approaching this as a potential abduction," Sheriff Tanner explained to the worried assembly present in the town hall on the 15th of November. "We have no indication of foul play, but Miss Rae would not have left her car and her duties without cause. The residents of Garibaldi did what small towns do best when something bad happens. They rallied around one another. Volunteers made flyers with Sienna's picture. The Coastal Herald posted daily reports on the case. Local restaurants delivered meals to the search teams. Residents of Garibaldi met at First Baptist Church each night to pray for her return. But as weeks became days, the hope slipped away, and the gossip started. Some thought that Sienna had been abducted by a transient who was just in town. The road to Portland ran nearby, and transients were not uncommon. Others talked of clandestine affairs, that perhaps she'd eloped with someone, and then there were people who turned to Walter Grayson, the last known to have spoken to her that evening. Grayson was interrogated extensively. He had a good alibi. He'd remained at the festival until midnight, witnessed by dozens of people, and gone home immediately after. His wife attested to it. He had no obsession or history of violence. "I hardly knew her," Grayson said to detectives. "We were discussing a co-field trip for our students, that's all." But then there was one disturbing tip from Harley Thompson, the local general store owner. "There was a black sedan with government license plates sitting outside my store that day," he said. "Two men in business suits came in, purchased cigarettes, and began asking unusual questions about teachers from around here." It was suspicious sounding, but police later dismissed it as a coincidence. Government cars weren't rare along the coast. Nevertheless, in a town that small, the vision of men in suits asking questions haunted like a campfire legend. By Christmas of 1966, the official search had slowed. Sienna's image peered out from post office bulletin boards and gas station walls all over Oregon, but fresh tips had evaporated. The case remained open, just cold. Garibaldi attempted to go on, but something in the town's character had changed. Parents became overprotective. Doors that were previously left open at night were now padlocked. The innocence of small-town security was lost. Gone along with Sienna Rae, no one grieved more than her 19-year-old younger sister, Dorothy. Dorothy Rae was just 19 when her sister disappeared, working as a nursing student in Portland and just starting to establish her own life. But when she heard that Sienna's car had been discovered abandoned on that desolate highway, everything changed. She packed her belongings, dropped out of school, and moved directly to Garibaldi. She rented a room in the town boarding house and effectively camped out in the sheriff's office. Small but mighty, sharing the same hazel eyes as her sister, although her hair was a bright blonde rather than deep brown, Dorothy would not let the case die. When official searches yielded nothing, she began her own. When the media lost interest, she contacted the newspapers herself. She interviewed Sienna's neighbors, classmates, and co-workers repeatedly, hoping to find the one piece of information everyone else had overlooked. "My sister didn't disappear," she said to anyone who would listen. "Someone knows something, and I'm not leaving until I know what happened to her." Others admired her resolve. Others sympathized with her. Dorothy took a photo album wherever she went, a collection of snapshots of the sisters' childhood, birthday celebrations, beach vacations, goofy smiles. Sienna smiled in each picture. Sienna holding Dorothy close in most. "We were alone after our parents passed away," Dorothy explained to Sheriff Tanner late one evening during one of their numerous conversations. "She wouldn't abandon me. Not without a word. She just wouldn't." As 1966 became 1967 and then 1968, Dorothy stayed put. She took a job at the local clinic, rented a small apartment, and became part of Garibaldi's landscape, a quiet, persistent reminder of the town's unanswered question. Folk started calling her the sister who stayed. No one suspected that Dorothy's quest would drag on for decades, or that when answers finally emerged, they'd force her to question everything she thought she knew about her sister, her family, and herself. Because Sienna Rae's vanishing wasn't a mystery, it was the tip of something much greater. A secret web woven by hands far more sinister than anything a small-town sheriff might ever dream of. The early days of the case followed the same sad pattern that occurs in so many cold cases. A burst of enthusiasm and hope, followed by a gradual lull into silence. But Sienna's case never really went away. Dorothy's indefatigable campaign kept it alive, and periodically, new forensic techniques, or a renewed public interest, drew it back into the news. In the first 3 years, Sheriff Tanner would not let the case grow cold. Each sighting was recorded. Each phone call was traced. The FBI stayed loosely engaged, looking for similar cases throughout the Pacific Northwest. A waitress in Astoria, roughly 60 miles north of Garibaldi, reported in April 1967 having seen a woman who resembled Sienna. The woman had eaten with an older man in a stylish suit, a far cry from the small-town schoolteacher's typical reputation. When the investigators presented her with Sienna's photo, the waitress was virtually certain she was her. The man was quickly identified on a credit card receipt. Harold Winters, prominent Portland businessman. Winters was cooperative to the extent of allowing officials to search his residence. His dinner date proved to be his secretary, Marlene Hoffman, a woman who bore little more than a casual resemblance to Sienna. Another promising lead lost. Soon after, on the anniversary of Sienna's vanishing, Dorothy hosted a candlelight vigil that attracted reporters from Seattle and Portland. The renewed publicity generated dozens of leads, but none panned out. By 1969, Sheriff Tanner was finally approaching retirement. One of his last actions, he gathered up every morsel of evidence, pictures, witness statements, timelines, into a single complete case file. "I don't want this one to fade away when I do," he explained to the Coastal Herald. "Someone somewhere has information regarding what became of that young lady." With the start of the 1970s, a new sheriff, Michael Donovan, took command of the department, and with him, new priorities. The Sienna Rae file still remained in the archives, collecting dust, but with no new leads coming in, it was increasingly difficult to find justification for the manpower. The town now had new crimes, new issues, new people. But for Dorothy, there was never a stopping point. Throughout the 1970s, the focus of Sheriff Donovan was drawn away, increasing drug traffic along the coastal road, a surge in property crime, and the effort to modernize the department. The file labeled Sienna Rae, missing 1966, remained forgotten in the evidence room, collecting dust. But not for Dorothy. She had constructed a secluded, dependable existence in Garibaldi, where she worked full-time as a nurse at the community clinic, yet her sister's vanishing was still the focal point of her life. Every available dollar she had went towards paying for her continuous investigation. During the period 1972 to 1978, she paid 3 successive private investigators, each one holding out hope for new leads, each one disappointing her with more questions than answers. The most detail-oriented of them was James Mercer, a retired Portland detective with a reputation for patience and precision. Dorothy employed him in 1976, and for 6 months he devoted himself to the case with old-school zeal. Mercer re-interviewed witnesses from the beginning, several of whom had faded or altered their memories with the passage of time. He even traced Sienna's life prior to Garibaldi, going to Oregon State University, interviewing her professors, and going through her student records. That's when he came across something unusual in her bank statements. During the 3 months before she disappeared, Sienna had withdrawn almost $2,000 cash, an astronomical amount for a small-town schoolteacher in 1966. No one was able to determine what had become of that money. She hadn't purchased anything of note, hadn't made any large payments. It had simply disappeared. She was getting ready for something, Mercer reported to Dorothy. Either to leave or she was paying. Someone for something significant. The enigma grew when he revealed a federal document indicating that Sienna had asked about a passport at the Portland Federal Building 2 months prior to her vanishing act. But no passport had ever been issued to her name. Nevertheless, despite these promising avenues of inquiry, Mercer's verdict was bleak. "The trail is too cold," he explained to Dorothy in a kindly manner. "In the absence of new evidence, without a body or a confession, we might never find out what became of your sister." It was the sort of utterance capable of breaking someone's spirit. But Dorothy did not quit. She never did. The 1980s introduced new technology and a new style of thinking to criminal investigations. Profiling, computer databases, and early forensic science developments started to bring to life long-dormant cases. In 1983, the Oregon State Police established a cold case unit officially, and among the first case files they retrieved from the storage room was Sienna Rae's Detective Sarah Linden. A co-founder of the unit was captivated by it. "The absence of evidence is evidence," she said in her review. "This isn't a standard abduction or murder. There's a strange degree of planning involved here." Linden came up with a new hypothesis, one that had never occurred to anyone before. What if Sienna Rae wasn't a victim at all? What if she'd been part of something more complex, something that involved intelligence or government activities? The timing fit. The height of the Cold War, the escalation in Vietnam, the growing presence of government research facilities across the Pacific Northwest. And there was that strange report from 1966, the black sedan with government plates, the men in suits asking questions about teachers. Maybe, Linden thought, it was time to revisit that lead. Her theory could have been just that, a theory, were it not for a surprising phone call received in 1987. Walter Grayson, the retired high school science teacher who had been the last person known to have seen Sienna on the night she disappeared, called Dorothy with a confession that shocked her. "She asked me questions about my time at Hanford," he told a tape-recorded interview with Dorothy and Detective Linden. "She asked me very specific questions about research work, about my clearance status. It seemed odd, but I didn't think anything of it until she went missing. I was afraid to say anything then. Afraid I'd get pulled in somehow." Hanford. That was no typical research facility. It was part of America's nuclear weapons complex, one of the most clandestine sites in the United States. Grayson had worked there for a short time in the 1950s. Before trading government service for the classroom, his words implied that Sienna's interest, or possibly her participation, may have exceeded second grade curriculum. Detective Linden followed up the lead forcefully, submitting federal information requests regarding any government activity in coastal Oregon between the 1960s. Each door she knocked on was respectfully closed. Records were classified. Agencies could not confirm or deny. Without tangible evidence, the theory of intelligence remained in the open but would not remain silent. And as the decade came to a close, A new era of forensic discovery was dawning. The 1990s would bring something no investigator in 1966 could have imagined: the ability to read the truth written in a single strand of DNA. By the early 1990s, DNA testing was revolutionizing the way law enforcement handled cold cases. While the technology itself had been around since the mid-80s, it wasn't until the 1990s that it became more accurate and more commonplace. In 1994, Dorothy Rae, in her late 40s and still possessed of the same intense will that had driven her for nearly 3 decades, made another appeal to the Oregon State Police. She requested that every item of evidence from her sister's case be retested using the newest DNA methods. The powder blue Chevrolet Sienna that had been driven by the killer all those years ago was long gone, sold years before. But the detectives still had the original packets of evidence: fingerprints, a lone shoe, and some strands of hair on the driver's seat. Initially, the results were not very promising. The fingerprints matched Sienna's own, plus a few partials, presumably of police officers or the previous owner of the car. The shoe yielded nothing new. But the hairs? That's where things got weird. The forensic report returned with a result that left them all confused. We have 3 separate DNA profiles from hairs that look visually identical. All 3 are females. All 3 have some genetic markers indicating possible relationship, but they are clearly from 3 different individuals. It was perplexing. The initial impulse was to write it off as contamination or laboratory mishap. DNA testing in mid-90s was still in its formative stages, and samples of that age were notoriously suspect. So the findings were quietly tucked away, another enigma within an enigma. By the millennium, Sienna Rae's case had become nearly legendary in Oregon. A 1998 Portland Tribune series on cold cases referred to it as the disappearance that defined a generation of Oregon law enforcement. And now, to you all watching, if it's late where you are and you're snuggled up with a blanket, listening to this story unwind, you know the sensation. There's something about these dark, decades-long mysteries that resonates different when the world outside your window is still, right? The early 2000s saw a national surge in interest in cold cases. Television programs such as Cold Case Files and Unsolved Mysteries were popular viewing. DNA advances were dominating headlines, cracking seemingly impossible cases. And then there was the emergence of the internet. Web forums, blogs, and online communities that teemed with amateur detectives eager to solve the cases official authorities had abandoned. Sienna's tale gained new vitality in this period. In 2002, a Seattle true crime blogger chanced upon her case while looking into Northwest vanishings. His step-by-step accountings brought in a dedicated internet following. Message boards hummed with theories, analysis, and speculation. Some were outlandish, others analytical, but all had one purpose: figuring out what actually took place on that foggy evening in November 1966. Dorothy, in her 50s and still a nurse in Garibaldi, welcomed this wave of renewed attention. She created a website devoted to her sister's case, scanning past newspaper articles, snapshots, and police documents, and participated in the online forums herself. She never did give up lobbying the Oregon State Police to reopen the case, and then in 2005, she got her break. The Oregon State Police Cold Case Unit, now equipped with improved technology and more resources, officially reopened the Sienna Rae case. Lead investigator Detective Marcus Rivera, a thoughtful man with a reputation for tracking even the smallest details to their logical conclusion, took charge. A man who was noted for saying, "Sometimes the answer's been right there all along. We just didn't have the right questions or the right tools to see it." Rivera focused on that unusual 1994 DNA report. With new technology, he retested the hairs from the car seat. The test verified the initial conclusion: 3 different but potentially connected female DNA profiles. This time, nobody brushed it off. Instead, it was the focal point of the new investigation. If you're watching along and are as curious about this story as we are, be sure to hit that like button. It gets more people interested in these old cases, and who knows? Perhaps someone somewhere still possesses a piece of the puzzle that will bring some resolution to this one. By 2007, Detective Rivera had come up with a theory of Sienna Rae's disappearance, one so surprising, so implausible, that he was reluctant to even mention it to his fellow detectives. But it turned out that the truth about the night of 1966 wasn't buried in the darkness. It had been out in plain view, stretched out over 3 separate states, and patiently waiting to be noticed. The enigma of Sienna Rae was on the verge of shattering wide open, uncovering realities that would test all that investigators believed about identity, memory, and even the nature of reality. By 2008, more than 4 decades had gone by since that misty November evening. But to Detective Marcus Rivera, the case had just begun to fall into place. DNA technology had made great strides by now. What used to be accomplished with visible samples could now be accomplished with the slightest smear of biological matter. And what took weeks could now yield results in hours, with precision that would have been considered science fiction only 10 years before. Rivera had taken 3 patient years to prepare for this moment, methodically rebuilding the case from scratch. It paid off in January 2008. He received a special grant from the Oregon State Cold Case Initiative, which was available for advanced forensic testing of long unsolved crimes. His proposal put it best: cold cases take patience and persistence, but they also take innovation. We have to view old evidence in new ways. That's precisely what he aimed to do, and the first big break came from the most unlikely source: the lone shoe discovered near Sienna's abandoned vehicle. For years, detectives had analyzed that shoe in every way possible. They'd looked for fingerprints, analyzed soil on the sole, and even the fibers. Nothing ever presented itself. But Rivera's team worked differently. Employing advanced vacuum filtration techniques, they obtained minute skin cells from within the shoe, skin cells that had naturally flaked off the foot of whatever person last wore it. It was a long shot, but it worked. Dr. Elaine Winters, the forensic biologist leading the analysis, couldn't hide her astonishment. "It's remarkable how well evidence can hold up when it's stored properly," she said. "Those skin cells were just waiting 40 years for technology to catch up." When the extracted DNA was finally uploaded into CODIS, the FBI's massive national DNA database, Rivera waited anxiously. On March 17, 2008, the results came in. That wasn't precisely shocking. If Sienna had been kidnapped by someone who'd never been arrested, or if she'd gone missing of her own accord, there'd be no record to link. So Rivera went further. He approved something more aggressive: familial DNA screening, a method that searches not for a precise match, but for close family members. This method had made headlines in recent months, cracking old cold murders by detecting relatives of unidentified suspects. When the results came in April of 2008, the case took a crazy turn. There weren't 1 or 2 near matches. There were 3. On the lab report, the DNA recovered from Sienna's shoe had strong family relationships to 3 women, all roughly the same age, each in a different state. Ellen Blackwood, 65, Boise, Idaho Catherine Mercer, 65, Spokane, Washington Ruth Donovan, 65, Missoula, Montana. Rivera blinked at the report. "Sure, there had to be a glitch. At first we thought it was a system error," he would later say. 3 different women, all with the same level of genetic similarity. It just didn't make sense. They ran the test again and again. The results were the same both times. Then Rivera's unit retested the hair samples taken from Sienna's car decades before. If the shoe results were strange, what happened next was irrational. The 3 separate DNA profiles of those hairs matched identically with Ellen Blackwood, Catherine Mercer, and Ruth Donovan. That's when Rivera realized this was no typical missing person case. "The evidence wasn't confusing," he said softly. "It was trying to tell us something extraordinary, but what would it possibly signify? 3 various women, 1 vanished educator, and a vehicle which had somehow held remnants of all their DNA. Contamination was the initial speculation, but it did not fly. The evidence had been kept under rigorous stipulations since 1966. and Rivera's crime lab experts established there was no contemporary cross-contamination. With that eliminated, the investigation gained an altogether new direction. Rivera put together a task force of specialized experts, a team of forensic specialists, seasoned cold case detectives, and even an FBI consultant famous for solving unusual disappearance cases. The more they investigated, the more it became apparent that Sienna Rae's disappearance wasn't merely a crime report. It could be something much more sophisticated. And as the pieces started falling in place, one possible haunting scenario began to appear, one that none of Rivera's team members could have anticipated. The investigation was now teetering on the brink of discovery and incredulity. Detective Marcus Rivera and his unit directed their attention to the three women whose DNA had somehow become entwined with Sienna Rae's decades-long enigma: Ellen Blackwood, Catherine Mercer, and Ruth Donovan. They started their investigation in the easiest way, researching Wikipedia. Their first move was easy: do some background research. What they uncovered, though, was far from easy. Each woman's record appeared normal at first glance: quiet existence, modest abodes, no arrest record, and no relatives to mention. But once experts started piling the facts alongside one another, a horrifying trend became apparent. All three women were born on the same day, April 12, 1943. All three had begun their working lives as teachers, as Sienna Rae had, and then later changed to completely unrelated careers. All three had maintained low profiles, minimal or no social media, limited or few friends, and practically no online presence. And then came the most startling revelation of all. None of them existed prior to 1967. No birth certificates, school records, or hint of what they'd been doing before that year, the same year Sienna went missing. It was like these women had just materialized out of thin air, declared FBI advisor Special Agent Tamara Wilson. No paper trail, no background, just there. This was when the task force's attention turned from what had occurred to Sienna to who Sienna actually was. The team came up with a theory that was as crazy as it was eerie. What if Ellen Blackwood, Catherine Mercer, and Ruth Donovan weren't three separate women at all? What if they were all Sienna Rae? It seemed ridiculous. But science, it turned out, had something amazing to say about that. Dr. Elaine Winters, the team's geneticist leader, saw an interesting fact hidden in the DNA information. These ladies aren't merely related, she explained to the group at a late-night gathering. Their genetic markers are pointing to something much more precise. They're identical triplets. The room remained silent. She went on to say that their DNA indicated only tiny differences. The type found in identical twins who arise from the same fertilized egg that divides early in development, if Dr. Winters were correct. That implied that all three women had the same genetic blueprint. That is to say, they would have looked precisely the same. Abruptly, a chilling possibility coalesced. If three identical women had been sharing the life of a single individual, alternating appearances in public as Sienna Rae, they might have effortlessly deceived all of Garibaldi. A sister might teach, another might travel, and the third do whatever clandestine responsibilities came with this lifestyle they shared. It would have been ideal cover. To try it out, Rivera's team surreptitiously collected new DNA samples from the three women: water bottles, coffee cups, discarded tissues, and verified what the preliminary results had already indicated. The DNA was a match, and when surveillance teams quietly snapped photos of the women at a distance, the photographic proof was inexorable, even in their mid-60s. They all had the same bone structure, same eyes, same smile lines. Time had weathered them differently. A wrinkle here, a streak of gray there. But it was like seeing three alternate realities of the same woman. They were, in every visible and genetic respect, older versions of Sienna Rae. Now Rivera was dealing with an ethical minefield. These women weren't reported missing. They hadn't committed any known offenses, so what business did he have intruding on their lives? "We had to tread very carefully," Rivera later said. This wasn't just about solving a cold case anymore. It felt like we were uncovering something much bigger, something that reached into government secrecy. So in June 2008, Rivera contacted the Department of Justice, inquiring about any classified Cold War-era projects that would have included women like Sienna. Weeks went by without a response. Then a response came, heavily redacted with strict confidentiality. What it showed was shocking. There had actually been just such a program. It was Project Mirror, an intelligence program run from 1952 to 1968. Its mission? To recruit and train identical siblings, especially twins and triplets, to be used in covert operations where impersonation and substitution might be crucial. Most of the files for the program had been destroyed in the course of intelligence reforms in the 1970s, but the remaining pieces were sufficient to validate the fact that something similar had existed, exactly in the course of Sienna's disappearance. "The documents didn't give us everything," Rivera said afterwards, "but they gave us enough to believe we were on the right track." There, the task force cobbled together their most credible explanation to date, one both exciting and profoundly disturbing. They suspected Ellen, Catherine, and Ruth Barnes, the triplets' birth surname, as pieced together from classified personnel remnants, had been inducted as children into Project Mirror. Conditioned to function as a unit, they had shared the single name of Sienna Rae for years. But something went awry. At the November 1966 Harvest Festival, their well-crafted cover could have been blown. Someone in Garibaldi may have caught someone being off, a slight disparity in behavior or looks between one Sienna and another, and when that occurred, Sienna Rae's identity had to go missing. The agents had told Marion and Harold Barnes that their daughters were exceptional. Their shared genetics, combined with their early linguistic ability and memory, made them perfect candidates for a top-secret federal research project. It was Project Mirror, and it existed as a cover for a psychological development study of prodigious children. It was, in reality, one of the most classified human intelligence projects of the Cold War. Ellen, Catherine, and Ruth Barnes were committed to government custody on a long-term educational contract that guaranteed their parents advanced education and lifetime security for cooperation. The girls were moved to a secure compound in Arlington, Virginia, where they received years of intensive cognitive conditioning, identity training, and behavioral synchronization. The avowed aim of Project Mirror was straightforward but sinister in its implications: to produce several operatives able to flawlessly take on one identity. Identical twins presented an unprecedented covert capability. They could take turns in the same persona, each one covering for the other as necessary, to conduct constant surveillance, infiltration, or information gathering undetected. They taught us to walk as one, Catherine explained in the 2008 interview. To speak the same, to write the same, to fake emotion on command. They told us that identity was a costume, something you put on and take off like a dress. The triplets explained years of psychological conditioning. They were renamed, learned to think of themselves as units of a whole instead of separate individuals. Their own sense of self was systematically deconstructed and reconstructed until, in their late teens, they could function in perfect synchrony. "Whenever one of us stood in front of the mirror," Ruth whispered, "we didn't see ourselves. We saw her, the her we'd been conditioned to be." By the early 1960s, the program had progressed from training to field deployment. As Sienna Rae, the sisters were sent into small communities throughout the United States, where they masqueraded as teachers, librarians, or clerical workers, mundane positions that provided access to people, routine, and information without evoking suspicion. Their work in Garibaldi, Oregon, was initially conceived as a social and psychological integration test. They were to be stable, long-term cover identities while gathering behavioral information on small-town groups, a secret study in community, trust dynamics to aid domestic counterintelligence operations. None of the townspeople ever suspected that Miss Rae was occasionally Ellen, occasionally Catherine, and occasionally Ruth. With time, though, The distinction between cover and reality started to fade. Sienna wasn't supposed to feel real, Ellen said, but she did. We began to love the children, the town, the sea air. For the first time, we felt human, not like instruments. And then there was November 12th, 1966, Harvest Festival night. It was Ruth. According to the sisters' testimony, who went to the festival that evening, she had been informed by their handler that the program was being internally reviewed. There were stories about congressional investigations into improper research methods, and Project Mirror would be shut down in no time. More seriously, someone in Garibaldi, maybe a guest official, had spotted her from a previous mission in New Mexico. Our cover was folding, Catherine stated. Procedure demanded instant extraction and dispersal of the active identity. Within a matter of hours, the Triplets put Contingency Plan 7B, Termination of Asset Identity, into action. They abandoned the powder blue Chevrolet on the side of the road, planted false leads, and went their separate ways under prearranged cover identities. By sunrise, Sienna Rae no longer existed. We did not vanish, Ellen informed Rivera. We retired the life they created for us. During the following few months, the women were aided by intelligence sources in creating their new identities. Ellen Blackwood in Idaho, Catherine Mercer in Washington, and Ruth Donovan in Montana. Their contact, a man identified only as Mr. Hale, provided them each with papers, money, and reasonable cover stories. When Project Mirror was formally closed in 1968, its few remaining documents were sealed or destroyed, leaving the Triplets specters of a program the government no longer claimed. They lived in secret for decades, maintaining sporadic coded contact but never face-to-face. They married, held low-paying jobs, and grew old into obscurity, until the letters arrived from Detective Rivera in 2008. When we got your letters, Catherine replied. Looking at Rivera across the table, we knew it was over. The world had caught up with the story. Hiding no longer made sense. The tape picked up several minutes of silence after their words. Rivera, in his own subsequent description, experienced a strange combination of awe, grief, and discomfort. This wasn't a missing persons case, he looked back. It was the exposing of a secret chapter in American history. The Department of Justice, confronted with undeniable genetic proof and the affidavit testimony of the women, upheld their immunity pact. The official record would state Sienna Rae's vanishing as having been resolved, even if much of the case file was still under wraps. Dorothy Rae, the woman who had searched for her sister for 40 years, was finally given the truth. The woman she'd loved and grieved had never existed. Sienna had been a shared face, a face worn by three strangers who had long passed on the life they had borrowed. Dorothy's response was one of quiet despair. "They stole my sister from me," she said, crying. Not through death, but through invention. Rivera shut the file in December 2008. On the last page of his report, he had written just a sentence. Those disappearances aren't about what's lost. They're about what was never there at all. The next day, the Triplets got a flash-coded message from their controller, Mr. Gray. There was a single sentence in it that they had been taught to understand since childhood, glass fracture. Initiate reflection protocol. It could mean only one thing. Their cover was blown. Everything we'd built as Sienna had to vanish, Catherine said quietly during her debriefing with Rivera. The life, the job, the friendships, all of it. Our existence depended on maintaining the illusion, and the illusion was broken. Within hours, the sisters enacted a prearranged extraction procedure. Catherine, recently back from Seattle, was instructed to burn everything from the field. Field notes, encoded messages, surveillance photographs, everything that would connect Sienna Rae's name with the project. Ruth set about packing their go-bags, complete with new passports, money, and railroad tickets to 3 different places. Ellen, keeping up her Sienna act as Garibaldi, was to orchestrate the act of disappearance itself. We weren't supposed to panic, Ellen recalled. We were supposed to perform. Every movement, every word, every tear had to feel authentic. If the cover was going to die, it had to die convincingly. That evening, Ellen took Sienna's powder blue Chevrolet along the coastal highway and parked it close to the bridge, where the tide and landscape would cover tracks. She dropped personal belongings, a shoe, a bracelet, and Sienna's teaching planner along the way, and then walked 3 miles to a pickup location where Mr. Gray was in a government sedan. "He told me we'd done well," Ellen said, her expression unreadable. Then he handed me my new passport and said, "Sienna Rae no longer exists. You're Ellen Blackwood now." And that was it. "It's remarkable how well evidence can hold up when it's stored properly," she said. "Those skin cells were just waiting 40 years for technology to catch up. When the extracted DNA was finally uploaded into CODIS, the FBI's massive national DNA database, Rivera waited anxiously. On March 17, 2008, the results came in. That wasn't precisely shocking. If Sienna had been kidnapped by someone who'd never been arrested, or if she'd gone missing of her own accord, there'd be no record to link. So Rivera went further. He approved something more aggressive, familial DNA screening, a method that searches not for a precise match, but for close family members. This method had made headlines in recent months, cracking old cold murders by detecting relatives of unidentified suspects. When the results came in April of 2008, the case took a crazy turn. There weren't 1 or 2 near matches. There were 3. On the lab report, the DNA recovered from Sienna's shoe had strong family relationships to 3 women, all roughly the same age, each in a different state. Ellen Blackwood, 65, Boise, Idaho Catherine Mercer, 65, Spokane, Washington Ruth Donovan, 65, Missoula. Montana Rivera blinked at the report. "Sure, there had to be a glitch. At first we thought it was a system error," he would later say. 3 different women, all with the same level of genetic similarity. It just didn't make sense. They ran the test again. And again. The results were the same both times. Then Rivera's unit retested the hair samples taken from Sienna's car decades before. If the shoe results were strange, what happened next was irrational. The 3 separate DNA profiles of those hairs matched identically with Ellen Blackwood, Catherine Mercer, and Ruth Donovan. That's when Rivera realized this was no typical missing person case. "The evidence wasn't confusing," he said softly. "It was trying to tell us something extraordinary, but what would it possibly signify? 3 various women, 1 vanished educator, and a vehicle which had somehow held remnants of all their DNA. Contamination was the initial speculation, but it did not fly." The evidence had been kept under rigorous stipulations since 1966, and Rivera's crime lab experts established there was no contemporary cross-contamination. With that eliminated, the investigation gained an altogether new direction. Rivera put together a task force of specialized experts, a team of forensic specialists, seasoned cold case detectives, and even an FBI consultant famous for solving unusual disappearance cases. The more they investigated, the more it became apparent that Sienna Rae's disappearance wasn't merely a crime report. It could be something much more sophisticated. And as the pieces started falling in place, one possible haunting scenario began to appear, one that none of Rivera's team members could have anticipated. The investigation was now teetering on the brink of discovery and incredulity. Detective Marcus Rivera and his unit directed their attention to the 3 women whose DNA had somehow become entwined with Sienna Rae's decades-long enigma. Ellen Blackwood, Catherine Mercer, and Ruth Donovan. They started their investigation in the easiest way, researching Wikipedia. Their first move was easy, do some background research. What they uncovered, though, was far from easy. Each woman's record appeared normal at first glance. Quiet existence, modest abodes, no arrest record, and no relatives to mention. But once experts started piling the facts alongside one another, a horrifying trend became apparent. All 3 women were born on the same day, April 12, 1943. All 3 had begun their working lives as teachers, as Sienna Rae had, and then later changed to completely unrelated careers. All 3 had maintained low profiles, minimal or no social media, limited or few friends, and practically no online presence. And then came the most startling revelation of all. None of them existed prior to 1967. No birth certificates, school records, or hint of what they'd been doing before that year. The same year Sienna went missing. It was like these women had just materialized out of thin air, declared FBI advisor Special Agent Tamara Wilson. No paper trail, no background, just there. This was when the task force's attention turned from what had occurred to Sienna to who Sienna actually was. The team came up with a theory that was as crazy as it was eerie. What if Ellen Blackwood, Catherine Mercer, and Ruth Donovan weren't three separate women at all? What if they were all Sienna Rae? It seemed ridiculous. But science, it turned out, had something amazing to say about that. Dr. Elaine Winters, the team's geneticist leader, saw an interesting fact hidden in the DNA information. These ladies aren't merely related, she explained to the group at a late-night gathering. Their genetic markers are pointing to something much more precise. They're identical triplets. The room remained silent. She went on to say that their DNA indicated only tiny differences. The type found in identical twins who arise from the same fertilized egg that divides early in development, if Dr. Winters were correct. That implied that all three women had the same genetic blueprint. That is to say, they would have looked precisely the same. Abruptly, a chilling possibility coalesced. If three identical women had been sharing the life of a single individual, alternating appearances in public as Sienna Rae, they might have effortlessly deceived all of Garibaldi. A sister might teach, another might travel, and the third do whatever clandestine responsibilities came with this lifestyle they shared. Catherine and Ruth were also moved, under assumed names, in a matter of days. Both were dispatched to separate states, were given job histories, and told to have little contact. They were assured by their handler that Project Mirror's activities would be reorganized and that their new lives were part of a broader, classified reorganization. Actually, the program was already disintegrating under congressional investigation and internal ethical probes. By 1968, Project Mirror had been formally disbanded, or at least deep-sixed. Documents were sealed under national security orders, individuals reassigned, and volunteers such as the Barnes sisters were ushered back into civilian life under assumed identities. For the Triplets, the years that passed were characterized by seclusion and silence. They obeyed their conditioning to the letter. No reunions, no photos, no Facebook. Each of them lived as a shadow of the same woman, splintered across three lives. We didn't know how to be ourselves, Ruth admitted. We only knew how to be Sienna, or whoever they told us to be. When the program was over, we weren't free. We were unmoored. Catherine reported waking up with repeated dreams about being in front of a mirror that showed three versions of her, each just offbeat. It wasn't fear, she whispered. It was confusion, figuring out which one of us was real. Detective Rivera sat silently listening to the women's tale. The room was thick with the burden of decades of deception, not the deceit of criminals, but of victims shaped by machinery far out of their control. He eventually conceded that even though the description in their book was otherworldly, each factual detail conformed to what little of declassified Project Mirror papers survived: the chronology, the jargon, even the psychological methods. When Rivera inquired if they had ever called Mr. Gray again after 1966, Ellen shook her head. No, we were informed he'd been reassigned. But occasionally, she said, I'd catch a glimpse of a man looking from across the street, just long enough to remind me we were never really alone. By the time their tale was finished, Rivera realized that it would be futile to pursue charges. These women were not fugitives. They were survivors of an experiment that dissolved the line between person and persona. The transcript of that 2008 session, still partially classified, concludes with Ellen's last words. People ask who Sienna Rae really was. The truth is, she was all of us, and none of us. She was what our country needed her to be, until the country forgot she ever existed. Rivera closed his notebook, leaned back, and exhaled slowly. "And now?" he asked. Catherine looked at him with a faint, weary smile. "Now," she said, "we'd like to stop pretending." Dorothy set her cup down carefully, her hands trembling just enough to make the porcelain clink against the saucer. Her voice was steady, but her eyes searched Rivera's face for any hint of hesitation. "You found her?" she asked softly. "After all this time?" Rivera hesitated before answering. "Not in the way you're hoping," he breathed, aware that what he had to utter would crumble the very foundation of Dorothy's existence, an existence structured around a search for someone who never existed. Sister Sienna Rae, the woman you knew. "She wasn't who you believed she was?" He spoke softly. "She was a participant in a secret government project that provided fabricated identities for use in intelligence gathering. Name, backstory, even the relationship to you, all were fabrications." Dorothy blinked, her brow creasing as she attempted to follow the words. "Faked?" she repeated. "The documents? School records? Her teaching license?" "All of it," Rivera asserted. Everything of her history was built by people operating under what was termed Project Mirror. The woman who resided in Garibaldi wasn't one individual at all. She was 3 identical sisters rotating back and forth, living under a single name. "And there's more," he stopped. "Dorothy, the similarity between you and Sienna wasn't an accident. Your relationship with her was planned." Dorothy leaned back, quiet for a really long time. Then she released a tiny, amazed laugh, the kind that doesn't come from being amused, but from incredulousness. "You're telling me that I was—" "What? A prop?" Rivera shook his head. "Not a prop, a safeguard. According to the information we've recovered, Project Mirror created limited background ties, fabricated family relationships to make their cover identities more believable. But in your case, Dorothy, there's something unusual. Your DNA shares a small but deliberate modification, markers that match the same pattern as the triplets. Someone altered your genome to create the illusion of relation." Dorothy gazed at him, the color falling from her face. "That's not possible. I was born in Oregon years before Sienna ever arrived here." "We verified," Rivera said softly. "Your birth certificate is authentic, but sections of your medical history were substituted in the 1950s. You were adopted as an infant by an agency that, when you were taken from them, was operating under federal contract. It seems you were unwittingly part of the same program, placed with a civilian family as a genetic control subject." Slowly, Dorothy stood up from her chair and approached the corkboard that had taken over her living room for decades. She gazed at the beaming photo of Sienna, the one she'd pored over so many times that the edges were worn from touching. "I spent 40 years talking to ghosts," she whispered. "And it turns out one of them was me." Rivera's tone gentled. "You weren't mistaken to look, Dorothy. You did everything out of love, out of loyalty. You thought your sister was out there. And she was, in a sense, just not as you thought she was." Tears filled Dorothy's eyes, though her tone stayed steady. "Did they ever consider what this did to the rest of us? To the people who grieved her? Who constructed our lives in the wake of the loss?" Rivera didn't have an answer for that. Some of the questions even decades of inquiry couldn't answer. Dorothy slowly turned to regard him, a look of tired comprehension on her face. "So what now? Are those women, the ones who were Sienna, are they in prison?" "No," said Rivera. "They came forward of their own accord. The Department of Justice offered them immunity for their testimony, their account being included in a classified report, most of which will likely never be seen." Dorothy smiled faintly, sadly. "Then I suppose that makes sense. Sienna always did have a way of vanishing." Rivera took his notes, not knowing how one closed a conversation like this. Just as he got to the door, Dorothy caught him. "Detective," she said softly but firmly, "do me a favor. Don't erase her. I know she wasn't real, but she was real to us, to this town, to those kids she taught. Whatever else she was kind. Let that part remain." Rivera nodded. "I will." As he pulled away from the small cottage at the perimeter of Garibaldi, Rivera looked back in the rear view. Dorothy stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the waning afternoon sun, her figure unwavering in the face of what she had just been told. At that instant, Rivera understood that the tale of Sienna Rae was not about lying or spying. It was about the need of human beings to connect, even if truth itself is ephemeral, and somewhere in a classified government document, 3 matching signatures lay next to one last declaration. Sienna Rae disappeared on the 12th of November, 1966. But her mission and her memory live on in the lives she left behind. Dorothy's eyes flashed with something between sorrow and rage. The sort of rage born only of betrayal, so large it could hardly be named. Following. "Orders," she kept saying, her voice shaking. "That's what they always say, isn't it? Following orders." She turned and went back to the table, grasping one of the photographs once more. The one of the little girl who so closely resembled her standing with the triplets. For years, she had pictured her childhood as a patchwork of giggles, shared secrets, and holiday with family. It was now what it was, a deliberately constructed illusion. "So even my memories were a mission," she whispered. "Every laugh, every photo, every anecdote I ever told about my sister, scripted." Rivera put down his notes, his tone low and even. "It doesn't diminish the love you had for her, Dorothy. What you did, what you contributed to this search, that was yours. That part wasn't programmed." Dorothy flashed a bitter half-smile. "That's the meanest part, isn't it? They made me real enough to feel." Neither of them said a word for a long time. The light from late afternoon streamed through the curtains, catching dust motes drifting through the quiet air. The house, once resounding with the din of her tireless quest for truth, now felt empty, as if even the walls listened. "Do they regret it?" Dorothy asked at last. "Those women, Ellen, Catherine, Ruth, do they feel anything about what they did to me?" Rivera paused. "They said they thought you knew." Dorothy laughed quietly, a sound as brittle as glass. "Of course they did." She slumped in her seat, fatigue seeping into her marrow. "What do I do next, Detective? Do I just continue to pretend to be a person that never did exist? What do you put on a driver's license when your entire life was an experiment?" Rivera sighed. "Legally, you're still Dorothy Rae. That identity is yours now, as much as anyone's ever could be. There's no point in reopening those records. The program's gone. The people who built it, most of them are dead." Dorothy was quiet for a moment, staring at the fading photo of Sienna that sat framed on her mantel. "Perhaps that is best," she murmured. "Leave the dead alone with their secrets." Rivera collected his papers but didn't stand to go. Something in the moment seemed holy, tenuous, in a manner that made him unwilling to break it. At last, Dorothy spoke again. Her voice altered now, softer, more stable. "You know what the worst is? I don't hate them, I want to, but I can't. I think of those women, living their entire lives in performance, never free, never able to say their own names aloud. Perhaps we were all captives of the same deception." Rivera nodded. "Perhaps that's why they came forward. Perhaps they were weary of living in the dark." Dorothy took the photograph one last time and gazed at Sienna's face, her face, one and the same. "You mentioned her purpose was to serve her country. Perhaps mine is to remember her, to remember them all." When Rivera did finally leave the small cottage, darkness had already descended upon Garibaldi. Streetlights came on one by one, and from the street, he could see the silhouette of Dorothy still at the window. Small, still, but unshattered. The Sienna Rae official report would go on to conclude with a single sentence: "Subject identities terminated. Emotional collateral indeterminate." But for Detective Marcus Rivera, and for Dorothy Rae, or Jane Doe number 7, it didn't end there. It stayed on in subtle ways. A letter that went unopened, a file that stayed locked in the desk drawer, a photo that wouldn't fade. Because sometimes the most profound mysteries aren't about who disappeared, but about who was left behind to live with the truth. Dorothy's hands, at first shaking, steadied as she heard Rivera's words. "They were trying to protect themselves," he whispered. "They thought touching you would put everyone at risk." Dorothy's eyes hardened. "I want to see them," she blurted out. her voice gaining power. "Not in an interrogation room. Not with agents and lawyers around, just us. I need to see them, to look them in the eye when they tell me why they let me waste my life on ghosts." Rivera had been anticipating this. "They've agreed," he stated. "Whenever and wherever you desire. They've considered you a lot throughout the years." Dorothy nodded, taking in the words quietly. Then, without further thought, she headed towards the corkboard that had dominated her wall for half a century, the maps, the newspaper clippings, and photographs that documented the story of a lifetime focused on one enigma. One by one, she started taking them off. Thumbtacks fell into a small glass container with soft metallic sounds. Headlines regarding the missing Rae sister were neatly folded. Photos were placed into neat piles. 42 years of searching, taken apart in a few minutes. "All this time," she whispered, "I believed I was searching for my sister. But I suppose I was actually searching for myself, for the truth of who I am." She hesitated, then stood up straight. "I have no idea who Jane Doe number 7 was meant to be," she told them, her voice firm and unshakable. "But I do know who Dorothy Rae is. She's the one who never gave up, the one who held on to faith when the rest of us let go, who created a life in this town, held space for someone she loved, even if the someone she loved was nothing more than an idea." Rivera met her eyes. Her eyes, for the first time that day, didn't appear lost. They appeared determined. "That's true," she said, "even if the why of it wasn't." As Rivera packed to leave, Dorothy stayed his hand with one last query. Her voice was gentle, near childlike. "The memories I have, the birthdays, the Christmas mornings, the summer vacations. Were any of them authentic?" Rivera paused, the burden of the question between them. But before he could respond, Dorothy smiled a faint, wistful smile. "Never mind," she said. "I suppose that's no longer what matters. The news of the Barnes triplets, and the elaborate, decades-long charade they'd lived, stunned shockwaves far beyond the sleepy coastal town of Garibaldi. What started out as a cold case in a small town had unraveled into something new, a secretive government program kept hidden for decades, which had tested manipulating memory and even creating identities. It challenged ethical and legal standards the justice system never had to deal with before. The search for the triplets was a masterclass in how to conduct modern detective work. When DNA profiles in the CODIS database showed a genetic irregularity, Rivera's team began a stealthy but persistent hunt with both old-school police legwork and high-tech digital forensics. Their findings came incrementally, a trail of breadcrumbs. Spread across the new world, Catherine. Mercer's scholarly articles were published in online academic journals. Ellen Blackwood's name came up in minutes of small-town school board meetings. Ruth Donovan's picture was hidden in a library employee directory. Each lead on its own seemed worthless. But taken together, property records, tax returns, social media ghosts, the beginnings of a pattern emerged. "We constructed a full profile of each woman," said FBI analyst Sophia Chin, who conducted the online investigation. "Their habits, their relationships, their travels. And that's when we understood. These weren't 3 distinct lives. They were 3 parallel ones. They authorized surveillance. Unobtrusive cameras were placed outside their homes. Cell phone records were scrutinized. Buyouts were silently monitored. The triplets' existence, unguarded, routine, and almost identical, was charted in haunting detail. They were living in plain sight, Rivera afterwards explained. Ordinary lives built upon extraordinary deceptions. They would have carried their secrets to their death if DNA, technology, had not caught up with them. When Rivera's letters finally arrived, sent to 3 states, simultaneously, their responses were virtually identical. Both women calmly packed a small suitcase, paid any pending bills, locked her door, and vanished. Traffic cameras traced their movements across highways and state lines. Gas station security footage showed the same steady composure. No panic, no hesitation. Within 24 hours, all 3 converged on the same location, the abandoned government facility in eastern Washington, where their lives had been rewritten 4 decades earlier. It was like seeing a ballet that was choreographed 40 years ago, Rivera remembered. Each move calculated, each step memorized. They were going home. When their capture was announced, the world responded in surges. Initially, headlines were straightforward. Cold case solved, 3 in custody. But as the facts came in of secret programs, forged identities, and a woman who had spent 40 years looking for someone who never existed, the tale grew from local curiosity to international reckoning. Governments felt compelled to react. Scientists were interrogated, ethicists populated TV panels, and ordinary citizens throughout the nation found themselves pondering the same uneasy question. If memories can be fabricated, how do any of us actually know who we are? When the complete truth eventually came out, the same triplets, the Cold War-era spy operation, the years of lying, the tale was nothing less than a cultural earthquake. National media swarmed the small town of Garibaldi, filling peaceful coastal neighborhoods with impromptu broadcasting areas. Representatives of the media packed sidewalks, satellite vans filled parking lots, and the local diner was converted into a de facto news bureau where producers purchased coffee for anyone who would speak. The Coastal Herald, the local newspaper that had been following the Sienna Rae disappearance from day one, published a special edition called The Truth Behind the Teacher. All of their copies were sold out in hours. On the internet, the tale went viral. Social media erupted in threads, arguments, and crazy theories, a few serious, some utterly outlandish. Ethicists, historians, and conspiracy buffs all had their say. Was this evidence of government abuse? A sad Cold War hangover? Or something even more sinister? In Garibaldi, the response was more individual. The residents wrestled to bring together the woman, or the 3 women, they had known as Miss Rae. "I had her for 2nd grade in '66, said Thomas Jenkins, now in his 50s. "Or I guess I had them." He laughed a little, confused. Wacky to realize the teacher I know existed could have been 3 different individuals. Makes me wonder about all my memories from that year. Old classmates brought out dusty yearbook photos, examining each image, looking for the slightest variation in expression or stance, anything that would indicate which sister had stood at the head of the room that day. Some were outraged. Others were merely intrigued. The majority, however, were left with the same silent bewilderment that hung over the town like fog on the coast. The judicial fallout was similarly knotted. The Barnes triplets had turned themselves in and were entirely cooperative, but their case posed prosecutors with a puzzle unlike any other. "This is not a run-of-the-mill criminal prosecution," said District Attorney Eliza Montgomery at a press conference. "The statute of limitations has long since run on most possible crimes. The women were following government orders while engaging in the deception, and the agency in question has been disbanded for years." Following weeks of discussion with the Justice Department and national security advisors, a special deal was hammered out. The triplets would not be charged with crimes, in return for full cooperation. They would provide testimony regarding the entire extent of the program, assist in naming other possible participants, and take part in secret debriefings with intelligence officials. "This resolution is more just than prosecution," Montgomery said. "These women were both victim and perpetrator, brought in as children into something they could not grasp, indoctrinated to lie as a civic obligation, and then left behind when policy changed. They were human experiments, not masterminds." The government's official response to what was now referred to as Project Mirror developed in phases, each one more unwilling than the previous one. Early on, federal agencies would neither confirm nor deny anything under the umbrella of national security. But as more facts filtered through investigative reporters and the testimony of the triplets themselves, silence was no longer possible. 2 months later, the Director of National Intelligence made a measured statement. It did admit that certain experimental human intelligence programs had existed in the Cold War years, efforts that would not satisfy today's ethical or legal standards. The statement stressed that all such programs had been ended by the early 1970s, and characterized them as products of their time. It was a classic government non-apology, and it did little to placate anyone. Congress wasn't having it. By December of 2008, The Senate Select Committee on Intelligence began conducting closed-door hearings. Although the hearings were still classified, sources leaked that the Barnes triplets gave testimony over the course of 3 consecutive days detailing their recruitment, psychological conditioning, and field operations in exquisite detail. The next March, the committee issued a heavily redacted report verifying what many people already suspected: Project Mirror existed. Between 1952 and 1968, some 36 sets of identical twins and triplets, and an unknown number of control subjects, such as Dorothy, were inducted into a covert behavioral intelligence project. The report disclosed that the project had been undertaken by a now-defunct branch of intelligence, whose budget was buried deep within military research budgets. Such programs were a serious ethical miscarriage, declared the committee chair. They used children, manipulated identity and memory, and destroyed lives. Not just the lives of those who were involved, but the lives of whole communities caught up in the fallout. The Senate report did more than merely reveal a forgotten chapter of espionage history. It called for accountability. It demanded a thorough review of all human intelligence, programs conducted during the Cold War, a discrete procedure for existing participants to report, and a federally funded reparations program for those whose lives were changed as a result of these secret experiments. The committee also called for sweeping changes, tighter control, independent ethics boards for intelligence operations, and mandatory reporting of any surviving programs on psychological or behavioral testing on human subjects. The revelations sparked a nationwide debate, and as word got out, fresh revelations started emerging from across the nation. In Michigan, an old woman came forward saying she was a member of a program called Operation Looking Glass, in which identical twins trained to switch roles were also involved. In Texas, one old man came forward to disclose that he and his twin brother had shared a cover identity in a border town in the 1950s, their existence orchestrated by handlers all for the sake of national security. Each successive disclosure added another tile to a chilling mosaic, establishing that Project Mirror had not been a lone experiment, but rather a component of a larger, systemic endeavor to weaponize identity itself. Historians and intelligence scholars were divided. Some referred to these programs as bold innovations created out of Cold War paranoia, an era when outsmarting the Soviets could justify almost anything. Others were much less charitable. These were not operations, said Dr. James Forrester, a historian of the Cold War. They were psychological experiments on children. They represented an era when behavioral science was fashionable, when ethics could be bartered away, and when secrecy protected decision-makers from accountability. It's a chapter America still has trouble coming to terms with. For the Barnes triplets, the legal resolution was welcome, but not peace. After years of being shrouded in secrecy, they were overnight public figures in a saga bigger than any one of them. Cameras trailed them out of courtrooms. Tabloids salivated over movie rights, but none of it interested them. By common consent, Ellen, Catherine, and Ruth retreated from the public eye, purchasing a small house on the Washington coast. For the first time since childhood, they shared a home, not as pseudonyms, not as agents, but as sisters. "We lost 50 years of sisterhood," Ellen said to Detective Rivera during their last interview. "Now we're trying to reclaim what time we have left." They turned down every offer that was made to them. Book deals, talk shows, documentaries. Their lawyer made a very brief statement. The Barnes sisters have spent their lives under the eyes of governments and in the view of the public. They now want to spend the rest of it in peace. The most surprising late twist came when the FBI named Harold Winters, a Portland businessman once questioned and cleared in 1967, as the triplets' initial handler, the mysterious Mr. Gray. Now in his 80s, Winters was arrested and charged with obstruction of justice and giving false statements to federal officials. His arrest triggered a domino effect, revealing the names of a number of other surviving officials who were involved in Project Mirror. Others were elderly and frail, living quietly in assumed names. Others invoked the "I was just following orders" defense. prosecutors proceeded cautiously, weighing responsibility against the limitations of time, age, and the hazy legal lines of classified authority. A special task force within the Justice Department was established to consider each case on its own, with particular attention to those who had actively engaged in coercive or abusive treatment. At the end of 2009, the case that had started with a car stranded on a foggy Oregon night in 1966 had rewritten the Cold War intelligence history. It had unfolded the sinister meeting of science and espionage, questioned the accuracy of memory and identity, and shown how far governments would extend themselves in the cause of national security. For the people of Garibaldi, the legend of Sienna Rae, the missing teacher, was finally laid to rest. The mystery was solved, though the truth was stranger than any rumor ever whispered in town. For Dorothy, the woman who had spent her life searching for a sister who never existed, the journey toward understanding her own identity had only just begun. And as for Ellen, Catherine, and Ruth Barnes, the truth had liberated them, not from punishment, but from the lifetime weight of secrets that they never elected to bear. The Sienna Rae case, or more accurately, the tale of the Barnes triplets, compels us to pose a question that haunts far beyond the edges of Garibaldi. The Barnes triplets existed as shards of one imaginary life, while Dorothy constructed her whole universe on the basis of a romance that, in reality, never happened. And still, somehow, the feeling they shared, the bonds they created, and the waves they made were totally real. As forensic analyst Dr. Elaine Winters, who assisted in cracking the case, once explained, identity isn't just who we think we are. It's who we are to others, the mark we leave on the world. Using that measure, Sienna Rae did live, perhaps not as an individual, but as the aggregation of three very real women whose lives became intertwined in amazing ways. It's been 5 years since the reality broke out of that fog-wrapped evening in Garibaldi back in 1966. Now Ellen, Catherine, and Ruth Barnes, the ladies formerly known as Sienna, share a peaceful coast house not far from the seaside house they shared in secrecy. They've mostly retreated from the limelight, refusing interviews and fanfare, but from time to time they provide their experience to investigators working on cold cases with connections to intelligence activities. Their expertise has enabled the closure of some forgotten investigations nationwide, and as for Dorothy Rae, the woman who had grown up thinking she was Sienna's sister, she has found peace with finally knowing who she truly is. Following an emotional reunion with the triplets, one that all 4 women said was painful but healing, Dorothy established an organization that helps children who have been impacted by government programs and psychological tests. She continues to reside in Garibaldi, where the villagers now know her no longer as the sister of the missing woman, but as Dorothy, a woman of strength and dignity who transformed heartbreak into purpose. Detective Marcus Rivera, the person who worked relentlessly on the case, was awarded the Oregon State Police Medal of Merit. Now, he commands a special unit that works on cold cases with interesting forensic hurdles. He likes to remind his staff, "The Sienna Rae case taught me something. Sometimes the truth isn't buried. It's right there, hiding in plain sight, daring us to look closer." The impact of this case goes far beyond Garibaldi. It revolutionized the investigation of cold cases across the country. Detectives now automatically consider the possibility of double or false identities in extended missing persons cases. DNA technology advances have made it more difficult than ever for the deceptions of the Barnes triplets to work. And in Washington, the pressure for government disclosure, triggered in part by this very case, has resulted in the declassification of thousands of Cold War-era intelligence documents. In Garibaldi itself, close to where Sienna's car was found all those years ago, there stands a small bronze plaque. It does not attempt to unravel the complicated web of truth and lies that characterize the mystery. All it says is, for those who lived through decades of uncertainty, that message tells it all. Ultimately, Sienna Rae's, or rather, the Barnes triplets and Dorothy Rae's, tale is a reminder that human narratives are seldom neat. Behind every vanishing act, every enigma, every ostensibly straightforward story exists the possibility of sensational complexity, and occasionally, sensational dishonesty. If this tale intrigued you, be sure to subscribe for more incredible true crime stories such as this one. And if the turns of this case left you in awe, share it with a friend who enjoys a good mystery. Tell me in the comments, where do you believe the next great cold case find is yet to be discovered?